Welcome to the Haftarah for Parshat Vayera. This is a really exciting Haftarah, a really great story, unlike the past 2 weeks where we've been in Yeshayahu in a little bit more of like an abstract, more poetic space. This week's Haftarah comes from Sefer Melachim Bet and is a story about Elisha. So I'll share my screen here. And what I thought we might do is use Sefaria to look at the story, but also stick with the some of the extra texts on my Google Sheet. I did forget, of course, to pull up the Sefaria. Let me do that right now. So just to give a little bit of background before we look at the text itself, Melachim is part of the Navi. It's part of the earlier Navi. Sorry, I'm a terrible multitasker. Here we go. Share the screen. The Gemara in Bava Batra tells us that Sefer Melachim actually is just one big work. So we split it into Melachim Aleph and Melachim Bet 1 and 2. And it is believed to have been written by Yirmiyahu. And is a recording of a 400-year period of Jewish history, so spanning many, 40, I believe, of the 44 kings. And Melachim Bet is the second part of this fourth book of the Nevi'im. And it details really the ups and downs, I would say, of the kingdom, the kings of the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, towards the end of the First Temple period. And there's a lot of betrayal of God. And so God sends the Assyrians to destroy the northern kingdom. For a while, the southern kingdom is under the reign of King Chazkiyahu. When his son succeeds him, God decrees the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile of Judah. So Melachim Bet sees us through a very tumultuous time. And through more than one Navi. So Elisha, the Navi, he is a prophet in this book, in this Sefer. He was the apprentice and then became the successor of Eliyahu. And he's known for his ability to be a miracle worker, which is what we'll see in this week's Haftarah. And in a lot of ways, I think he's meant to be the he's the other side of the Navi coin from Eliyahu. So where Eliyahu is sort of fierce and filled with fire and brimstone, Elisha comes to work miracles, to heal the sick and resurrect the dead, to provide food for those who need it in a much softer way. So with that in mind, we're going to look at two stories, and I thought that we would just read a part of them together and see what comes up for us. And I put a few Rashis on our source sheet to help keep things interesting. And I think one of the big framing questions for the Haftarah, or maybe the two framing questions, one is, why are we reading this Haftarah for this Parsha? And I think particularly here, there's a question about what do these stories add to the canon of the Navi, of Tanakh, right? These are deeply personal stories about unnamed characters, for the most part. And so it's curious why these personal stories feature so heavily within Tanakh at all. So the first story is a story about Isha Achat, an unnamed woman. We know that she is one of the Neshei B'nei HaNevi'im, one of the wives of the disciples of the prophets, and that she goes to Elisha and she says, Abdecha ishi meit v'ata yadata ki abdecha haya yarei et Hashem. She says, your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that he believed in God. And now a creditor is coming to seize my 2 children as slaves. So this is a very troubling opening to the Haftarah. Certainly a story about the loss of children, perhaps a connection to the Parsha. Rashi connects this woman to Ovadia. He says that she's Eshet Ovadia. So Ovadia is one of the prophets in service of the king of Achav, who was the king of the north. And when Izebel, Achav's wife, decreed that all the prophets should be wiped out, right, in her own whatever. We could explore her maybe some other day in her own insecurity or in her anger. She puts like a hit on all of the Nevi'im, and Ovadia, it is said, hides 100 of those prophets in caves, and he uses his own money to do so. So by linking this woman to Ovadia, it seems like what Rashi is saying is this guy wasn't like a gambler. He wasn't lazy and didn't work at all. He was like a respectable character who actually went into debt because he was doing this great thing and saving these Nevi'im. And this woman is saying, right, she's highlighting, how could this be that this is the reward for someone who is so righteous, for someone who loved God so much? And so Elisha says to her, Ma aselacha, what can I do for you, right? How can I help you? And then he says, Ma yesh lach babayit, what do you have in your house? And she says, I have nothing, but I actually have this one asuch shemen, a jug of oil. And that's what the miracle is going to be based on, is this one piece. And Rabbi J.J. Schechter has this beautiful lesson about, he doesn't say, do you have something in the house? He says, ma yesh lecha, what do you have? With the sort of the assumption that everyone has something in their house, even if it's only an asuch shemen, only a small jug of oil, and that we have to use what we've got in this world, right? And so Elisha is saying, like, dig deep, Mrs. Ovadia, find the thing that will, that we can build off of. We can build our miracle off of. And I think that maybe when Rashi says the thing about Ovadia, maybe that's part of what she has in her house, is that she has this legacy of Ovadia being someone who is worthy of intervention because of all of the work that he's done so far. Of course, everyone deserves not to have their children taken into slavery, but that maybe is part of what she has in her house. And so Elisha says, "Vayomer lechi she'ali lecha kelim min hachutz." Right? What's the next thing that you do? First, you find what you've got, and then you go ask your neighbors for help. You turn to your community, and that's a super important part of the story. Miracles are not something that happens in a vacuum within the world, but they happen with the things that you have and then within your broader community. And I think that right now, especially thinking about everything that's happening in Israel, where people are being displaced, but immediately they've been absorbed into other safer parts of Jerusalem, and people are making meals for each other, right? That like the community piece is almost a miracle in and of itself, perhaps, is what I would say. But so Elisha says, go to your neighbors, borrow these extra jugs for oil. And then he says, Uvata v'sagart hadelet ba'adech. Uva'ad banaich. She says, go in and shut the door behind you and your son. And I will admit that at first I didn't like that, right? I think like closed doors can lead to secrets. They can lead to false tales, right? I'm sure that Nelson knows as a doctor, you never close the door to your office with no windows in the door if you have just one female or male person in your office, right? It's always better to leave the door open or to have a nurse in the room or to have a window so that people can see in, because closing the door is not good, right? Secrets are not good. But Rashi says something really interesting here. He says that closing the door affords respect to the miracle, kavod hanes, because nisim, miracles, are supposed to come behetznea, to come about in secret, but maybe in modesty, maybe in quiet, right? That they're not flashy, sort of unlike the miracles of Yetziat Mitzrayim. This is a miracle that's going to happen in a more intimate setting, maybe is the way to think about it. And he says that, right, the miracle is basically that you will keep pouring, sort of like the miracle of Hanukkah, and you'll be able to fill all of your vessels, and then the oil will stop, and then she can go sell it, and your children can live on. So this is story number one. Miracle number one is about children who are about to be lost but are not yet, because of a creditor problem. And some kind of miracle happens in secret. And it happens based on three factors, which I think we saw here. Molly Morris in the 929 project writes this beautiful short piece, right? Step one, identify what you have to work with, right? Ma yesh lecha b'bayit. Step two, ask your community for help, right? She didn't have to do it all by herself. And step three, allow God in and remain modest about the help received. So I think that's a beautiful sort of summation of this first story. Any thoughts before we, I don't want to charge ahead. I will say that I was listening to a podcast, a super interesting podcast called Epilogues of Torah. It's by someone named Rabbi Yaakov Trump, who sounds to me to be maybe South African or Australian or maybe English in his delivery. And he mentioned Rabbi Norman Lamb, and he said that Rabbi Lamb says that this is a metaphor for the diaspora, that sometimes when we live outside of Eretz Yisrael, we feel impoverished and we feel like our children end up sort of drifting away from us, almost as if the creditor has come to take them away. And I was struggling with this metaphor today because it feels too real, right? I think in Israel, it feels too real. Our children were taken away, and that feels heartbreaking in a way that there's no miraculous intervention in this moment. And I felt the same way throughout the second story. So I think there's something beautiful about the story. I used to love it as one of the stories of the Navi. I love Elisha as sort of like a softer prophet. I love this idea of building on what you have, but certainly the miracle is needed. It's not enough to build on what you have and to involve your neighbors. The oil still had to fill all the jugs. And so I'm not sure where I land there, but maybe it will all come together. But I welcome thoughts if anyone has one first.
Yeah, I like the idea that she went to ask the neighbors for help. She's not alone. The important thing. I saw one somebody reporting from Israel a couple of days ago saying, "We the people," and I really mean we the people got together, and we are, like you said, helping food for everybody, getting together with meal support, and that was one of the things.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I agree. And it's something I had never noticed. If someone had asked me to tell this story again from memory, I don't know that I would have remembered that detail to add. So I was glad I went back to look again.
I think today that was President Herzog that said, we as a family or as a united people, we will prevail because of our unity.
Right. If we think of ourselves as like bringing the empty jugs, right? We are the empty jugs. We're waiting to be filled with oil, whether through a miracle in private or a miracle in public. But channeling that emunah is certainly very difficult at this time. But yes, I think it's a beautiful, that in that way, it fits beautifully here. So the second story is another well-known, maybe even more well-known story of when Elisha would go to Shunem, which was outside, I guess, of his day's journey. And so there was a wealthy woman, and this woman, like the woman in the oil story, remains anonymous. We don't know her name, but she was an Isha Gedolah, wealthy woman, and she would offer him to have a meal. And one time she said to her husband, well, maybe if he comes here all the time, right, hu over aleinu tamid, we should actually have something more than a meal for him. We should have a whole bedroom for him. So she gives him something with all to fit all of his needs, right? Na'asa aliyat kir, enclosed for privacy, katana v'nasim lo sham mita, a bed, v'shulchan, a chair, a table, v'kisei, a chair, u'menorah, a lamp for light, v'haya b'vo elenu yasur shama, and then he can stop there whenever he comes by. So the text is going out of its way to portray her as a thoughtful and very generous woman. And Elisha seems to hear about this room, and he takes her up on her offer, and he appreciates it. And so he has a servant in this story named Gehazi, and Elisha asks Gehazi to call this woman, the Shunammite woman, to him, and he wants to do some kind of favor for her, right? I heard in some, I think Rabbi David Silver said it's like he wanted to like erase her parking tickets, right? He's like a bureaucrat, and he's like, "How can I help you? You've been so kind. What like backroom deal can I do for you?" And she says, "Ani betoch ami anochi yoshevet." I sit amongst my own people, like I don't have any need. But Elisha is unhappy with that because, right, that's like an imbalance of power. He wants to feel like he was able to give something to her. And so he turns to Gehazi and he says, Mala sotla, what should we do for her? And so Gehazi says, Aval ben en la v'isha zaken. And so here we see another connection to our parsha, and I will admit one that I feel like, right, it is so obvious here that in Gehazi's eyes, what does she need is a son. It's not that she is a isha gedola anymore, like a well-off woman who's done this generous thing. She is just a barren woman. And I think that's a hard label to attach to her. But he notices that she has no son and her husband is old, which mirrors very much the language in our parsha about Abraham being old, right? About coming to our old age without having children. So certainly a parallel to our parsha. And that satisfies Elisha. So he calls her to him. And he says, you will have a son, right? And there's a lot of fascinating discussion. I had to choose a path. Maybe next year we can explore, how could Elisha say this? Is Elisha saying that she will have a child? Is Elisha sort of reporting what God said? Who's driving this prophecy? It's a little bit unclear. It seems like the Gemara wants to say that only God can decide who has children. And so this is sort of tricky. But one way or the other, Elisha says, you will have a son. And she gets upset, right? She says, don't tell me this story, right? Don't lead me to believe. Al tichazev b'shifchatcha. Don't delude your maidservant with this story. I'm old, right? But yet, v'tahar isha v'teled ben. In fact, it ends up coming true, just as Elisha said, asher diber alaha Elisha. So you would think that this would be a happy ending, but to parallel the Abraham and Sarah and Yitzchak story, something bad has to happen, right? My kids are learning how to tell stories. First, there's the introduction, and then the problem, and then the resolution, and the climax, and then sort of the conclusion. So we know we're waiting for this bad thing to happen. And sure enough, the child grows up, V'yigdal hayeled, he goes out into the field. Suddenly he calls Roshi. Someone at Shul was telling me that there are two sort of episodes of some kind of brain damage or something like that in Tanakh, and this is one of them. I already have forgotten the other one. But something happens, maybe some kind of heat stroke, maybe something else. And the father says, Sa'ehu el imo. And so I think, I can't remember who it was, but someone, I was listening to a podcast that was saying that in some ways there's two primary actors here, the Shunammite woman and Elisha, right? They're the power players. And her husband is really not a decisive person. In some ways, he's the supportive character to the Shunammite woman, right? When his son is in immense physical distress, he says, carry him to his mother. And he's not even involved in this prophecy of having a child. And similarly, Elisha has Gehazi, his servant, to be sort of his supportive character. So the boy is brought to his mother. He sits on her lap. It's a very sad scene to think about, that he sits with her until he dies later in the day. And so what does she do? She gets up, right? She doesn't cry out. She doesn't rent her clothes. She gets up. She leaves him on the bed of Elisha in his spare room. V'tiskor ba'ado, right? Interesting parallel to the first case. She shuts the door and she leaves. And she calls to her husband with this plan of action, right? I'm going on a donkey to get the prophet, to get Elisha, Isha Elohim. And he doesn't understand, whether he doesn't know that his son has died, or he thinks his son has died and it's not appropriate to go to the prophet. It's unclear, but he questions her, but she says, Shalom. Now, interestingly, this is where Sephardim stop reading the Haftarah, which is, I think, right in the middle of the story. It's such a hard place to end. It seems that the Sephardim often ends in an earlier place. They don't want to burden the Kahal with a long Haftarah. To me, this is like, I don't know, Nelson, if you remember the movies when in Israel, like in the 80s and 90s, the intermission was often like right in the middle of a sentence. I think because they were assuming people were reading the subtitles, but as like an English speaker, I went to the movies once or twice with my cousins, and it's like very shocking. I could imagine that would be like that, right? Like to end right here. But she is very dismissive of her supportive character, right? She doesn't engage in the discussion with him. She just says, I'm going, basically. She goes to Elisha. She finds him, right? From afar, Gehazi sees her, right? And he says, Hine Hashunamit halaz. Here, the Shunamit is coming. And Elisha says to her, well, go ask about her, how she's doing. How is the child? And interestingly, she says the same thing to Gehazi, the other supportive character, that she says to her own husband, Shalom, fine. She's not interested in talking to anyone but Elisha, obviously, right? She's like not wasting any time. She comes up to Isha Elohim, El Hahar. There's sort of like you can imagine him standing up on high. And V'techazek baraglav, she grabs his feet in a way to catch his attention, perhaps. And Gehazi feels that that's inappropriate, and he steps forward to push her away. But Elisha says, no, it's okay. Marala, kinafsha marala, her soul is in bitter distress. And here we see the Hashem ha'elim mimeni, velo higidli. It's almost like petty what Elisha's saying, right? I didn't know. God didn't tell me. Which goes back to like, whose prophecy was this? Who feels that they are in charge in this story? I'm not sure. Someone is in charge. And she is mad with Elisha, right? She says, I didn't ask for this son. I didn't ask for this, and yet you gave him to me, and then I got attached to him, right? You can imagine she's saying that, and now I'm heartbroken. Why did you mislead me? Almost as you can imagine, right? I think in some ways I like Shunamit as like a relief of Sarah, right? We don't get to hear a lot of Sarah's words around the Akedah, and it's like interesting to imagine that maybe she would have said some of these things to Elisha or to God, right? To Abraham, to whoever. Like, I didn't ask for a son, right? We know that Rachel cries out for children, but I don't think that Sarah does that, right? And then she gets a son, and then he gets taken away. It's maybe a similar parallel. And Shunamit, the Isha Shunamit gives us like an insight maybe into how Sarah might have felt as well. And Elisha says, I'm going to help, basically. And they rush back to the house. And they go in, and the boy is, right, mate mushkav al mitato, still the same as he was. Again, vayavovi skor hadelet, right? There's something about like the intimacy of God's miracles in this Haftarah. And then Elisha does something, piv el piv, right? Maybe, it's hard to imagine that this woman went all the way to find him and came back with Elisha, and still the CPR is the appropriate response, but something happens. Vayacham basar hayeled, and the child becomes warm again. And then Elisha gets down from where he was on top of the boy and walks around the room. And then the boy sneezes 7 times, an interesting sort of almost magical detail, and opens his eyes. And Elisha calls out to Gehazi and says, bring me the Shunamit woman. And she comes in, and he says, Si'i benech, pick up your son. And Vatavo v'tipol al raglav, again, she falls down at his feet, but she doesn't have to grab them anymore, right? Because she's got him what she needs. V'tishtachu arza v'tisa et bana v'tetze. So this is like definitely the conclusion of the story. This is where we finish the Haftarah reading. At this place. So I think that both of these stories are fascinating. There's so many interesting and beautiful details woven in and out of both stories. But I think the question of why this is our Haftarah remains at least a little bit. And so this podcast by this Rabbi Yaakov Trump, he says that, right, there certainly is this part about it being like Sarah Imenu, right? Someone who's struggling for a child, and then their child is lost to them and then brought back to them. But also he suggests that it's what he calls a metaphor for Israel, that the story of Abraham and Sarah is a story of a struggle for continuity. where it seems like we are given that space and then it's put at great danger or at great risk, right? Either with the Akedah in our Parsha or with the boy dying in the Haftarah, and that we have to find some way to reconnect to God, to close the doors, to recenter, to ask for a miracle and to receive such a miracle, to keep going. We need to hold on to that emunah or that hope. We need to talk to God. We need to do something to reconnect, to continue the continuity. So in some ways, the Haftarah is like broadening the focus of the Torah reading, maybe in that way, to say it's not just Abraham and Sarah. And that I think is possibly why the Shunammite woman doesn't have a name, is because it's not one specific person. It's the story of like our people. Where we hope for continuity, we receive it, it feels at risk, and then we have to find some way to get it back, which I think is beautiful. But what I think really brings the point home, which is really connects it for me, is Rabbi Trump said, well, how does the first story connect? Right? Why didn't we just start at the story of the Shunammite woman? The first story is so short also. But he points out that it's actually quite a terrible story. Like, we take it at face value, but the idea that anyone, let alone a prophet's family, is in danger of having their children sold into slavery is like not a very nice society in which to live. Not a nice society that we've cultivated in the land of Israel. And that it almost sounds like a place of Sodom, right? Where we don't value the family, or we don't honor our community. And that we've like drifted very far from the Abrahamic tradition. And so we want continuity, right? We say we want it, but yet at a moment's frustration, we're willing to sell off people's children into slavery. And so it's almost as though the story side by side reminds us that we can't have continuity and rely just on God, which is why perhaps the woman needs to go into her community, right? To say, yes, the second story is about reminding us how Hashem will save us from these times of distress, from the Akedah, to resurrect the dead, to do things only Hashem can do. But let's not get there, right? Let's not put ourselves in such grave danger. Let's make sure that we live in a world that embodies the values that will allow us to have continuity that's important, that makes sense, that means something to us. So I thought that was a really beautiful message, that it sort of puts the ball back in our court. It's not just about God performing miracles, which seems sort of unattainable to me at this moment. It's about creating the world in which we want to live. So I was very determined to find a song in every Haftarah. And so the song that I saw suggested, and I think fits within this sort of scheme, is Olam Chesed Yibaneh, right? That when we create the world, when we build the world with our children the way that we want it to be, that then we won't come into this, into such a dire place of discontinuity. So it's a little bit of a stretch, but it's at the bottom of the source sheet here. But I would love to hear everyone, your thoughts and ideas.
No, I was thinking about the Akedah all the time. I was thinking of the parallel. I just couldn't weave it through the story so well as you did. But
I practiced.
the other thing that the other piece that I thought was the book of Job. Everything she had was that boy, and all of a sudden was taken away from her. And, of course, Job asked God, "Why did you do that to me?" And God said, "You can't figure out. You don't understand. You don't have the means to. Well, you are not, who created the animals, the elephants? I did. You did not. So you don't know what it is. So some cognitive humbleness. You don't have to know everything. Leave it to God."
Yeah. Eov is definitely like a story that's more power is given to God, I would say, than that sounds sacrilegious, I guess. But the story is told from a more God-centric position, maybe, right? That we don't deserve to know all the things. And it seems like here the Shunammite is able to sort of, if you think of Elisha as a stand-in, right? He's known as the Isha Elohim here, right? The man of God. if he's God's representative, she's sort of able to get through all of the things, her husband and Gehazi, to get right to him in a way that even when Eov is sort of talking to God, doesn't seem to have as much access to God's chesed, at the very least, I guess.
Yeah, if I may be allowed to complement what you said, coming from a non-Jewish source, one of my most favorite theologic quotations comes from Saint Augustine. Somebody once wrote a letter to him saying, I didn't understand this, but now I'm trying to understand God, and now I understand God. And Augustine's response was, if you understand it, it's not God. You can't fathom God. You can't understand God. God is human understanding. Which is more or less what the book of Joel says.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think it's easy to sort of end the Akedah story with that perspective.
Yeah.
Right. For whatever reason, I think the Alicia story has like you feel better at the end, right? The Shunamite set out with a very clear purpose to revive her child. She pushes back in a way that Abraham doesn't, right? And so when the resolution comes, I think we feel more confident. But certainly with the end of the Akedah story, I think we are sort of left wondering, what was God's intention? Did the story resolve the way God had started it, right? It does feel more like the Saint Augustine ending, right? If we figure it out, then it's probably not God. Whereas the Navi is already written from a perspective where it does feel like we have more control in some way, more understanding.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to stop the share.
Okay.